still active in ranching in that area. So without further ado, what I will do is introduce each of these people to you, and they'll give us a little information about their background. And then our objective is to let them carry on the discussion so that we can get a little synergism going here and understand what life was like in early Missoula. Okay, Francis, would you give us a little background on where you were born and what have you up through college maybe?
I was born on University Avenue in a house my father built. It's across the street from the Randall Apartments and the Fidel houses on the other corner. What else should I say about that?
Well, where did you go to school?
Well, went to the Roosevelt grade school and the high school here, and 3.25 years of university. And then I had an opportunity to be a traveling companion to a Dutch lady, and so I did not graduate that year. I was with the lady 2.5 years approximately, and then came home. I'd had enough of that. And of course, those were the years of the Depression. I was gone to Europe the year of 1931 to 33. And when I came home in 1933, it was wonderful to be home, but it was pretty hard finding a job. But I did get a job at the Missoula Mercantile, which is now the Bond, but the Mercantile hardware, I got a nice secretarial job.
Okay. Eunice, did you go through your early life a little bit in Bourne School, what have you?
Well, I was born here in Missoula, December the 8th, 1895. No, not 1895, but 1895, that's right. Sometimes when you're in your 100th year, you forget a few things, you know. And I was born in a house at the end of the bridge. What is the name of the bridge?
Orange Street?
Orange Street Bridge. And you look down the hole, and down there on River Road is a green house, and I was born there. Then I was taken to Potomac to a cattle ranch and lived there until I was through the grades. I went to the grade school in Potomac, Montana, and after grade school I came down to Missoula High School, graduated there in 1916, and then went to Dillon and got my BA degree in Dillon, and then from Dillon in 1918 I went to the Bonner School and taught there until 1935. And my husband became an invalid, and so I had to quit teaching and be with him here in Missoula. And he was an invalid for 11 years and 9 months. And during that time, I was a jack of all trades. And I decided that I should get into something more productive. So I opened the Eunice Brown gift shop next to the Wilma Theater, which was a very wonderful adventure. And I was there 12 years, and so people came into my shop one day, and they said, "We're looking for a business, and we think you'd like to buy your gift shop." And I said, "I have no idea of selling my gift shop, but I'll let you know in the morning." I stayed up all night, took general inventory, sold my shop. Well, then I was out of a job. And the people from the business college came to me, or they came to my mother's 80th birthday party that I had on the 8th of January. And I had gone out of my shop on the 1st of January. And they said, "Now that you've sold your shop, you have to teach at the business college." I said, "Jerry, I know nothing about business subjects." He said, "We'll educate you and hire you." I said, "You can't educate me because I'm 60 years old." He said, "Oh, yes, we can." So they did. They sent me to Chicago and Seattle and Los Angeles. for my education. And my hardest study of those few months that I was away was learning to teach shorthand. But I became a good shorthand teacher, and I stayed at the business college for 12 years, and they are my very closest friends. Then you want to know the rest of my...
Well, we'll go on,
What?
we'll go on and ask you some other questions later, or we'll bring some of that stuff up.
I thought probably you wanted to know where my
Yeah.
next business was.
Well, why don't we cover that later? I'm sure
Okay.
that will come in
That's
later.
fine.
But let me ask you one specific question. Where were you when the first airplane came to Missoula?
I was in Missoula.
Did you get a ride on that plane, or
Mhm.
how was that?
It was wonderful. I thought it was wonderful. And my sister wouldn't ride because she was afraid, but I thought it was great.
Good. Good. I think David had a ride on that first airplane too. Is that right, David?
The first airplane,
Yeah.
I remember when it came into town, it came through the gap between the mountains. It wasn't high enough to go over the mountain. And I remember it came in and sailed around and landed at the fort, on some of the fort land. And we had heard about that ahead of time, so my father had hooked up his carriage. He had a pretty fancy carriage, and he put us all in it. And he had a pretty good pair of steppers, and came to town from the ranch just to see the airplane. And we were parked out there in the Fort Lands when the airplane came down, and of course everybody wanted to run and see what it was like. My brother was about 10, and he disappeared right away, and they found him over by the plane, looking at it to see what it was made of, and or that sort of thing. But I was too little; I couldn't go over and see it. But it was a good show. It was a biplane, and I think the pilot was Walter Beck, if I can remember right.
Mm-hmm.
And Walter Beck was an old-time aviator here. He kept at it until the planes got to be bigger and better and noisier, and we had a good time, had our picnic lunches along during that time. That's the best I remember of the airplane. I don't remember when it pulled out.
But don't you remember that they charged $1 if you wanted to ride?
I don't remember when it left, but it was there and settled down.
David, could you start at where you were born and where you went to school?
When I was born in the big house on the ranch, the large house had been recently moved from my mother's homestead about 1,000 feet away, and she had added quite a lot to that house, and it's as it appears now, the way she had it rebuilt. And I was born in that house, and we all of our my sisters and brother were born either in the house or in the cabin. Sam, my brother, was born in the cabin in 1896, I think, and that was the second home, I think, that my father built after his homestead. About 2 years after his homestead, he built the log cabin, and we still have the log cabin, and we use it too sometimes. I have, I guess, slopped over some and put wiring in it and water in it so that we don't have to run out and do all those things. And there is a pump furnishing water for that cabin and for the big house, and all around that complex of buildings that have been built up there in the last 50 years.
Well, where did you go to school, in grade school?
We were, we had to go about 3 miles south to the Carleton School. Carleton School District was where the house was located, but our home was only a half a mile inside of the Lolo School District, and it was not proper to go to Lolo School, even though it was closer. It was more like 2.5 miles, but this was 3 miles, and the way that was worked out, the girls and my brother continued to grow, and they had a buggy and an old horse called the Wit. He would take us to the school during the early part of the day, and then he'd stand there all day and take us back home. But about in the 4th grade, about that time, the school was consolidated with Florence. So it was a Florence Carleton school that we had to go to. That was 7 miles away, and they had a kind of a closed conveyance to take us, an old lumber wagon with a kind of a canvas top over it. And during the cold weather, they had a stove they could put in there and keep us from freezing. But it was quite a job to get to the school. We were the farthest from the school, and it was about 7 in the morning that we'd have to leave. It would take about 2 hours with the old horses to go to Florence Carleton School, and that went that way for a long time. And old man Strickengust was one of the drivers. He told us stories about what happened to him when he was helping drive the cattle from Texas up to Montana, and he impressed me a great deal because I was getting to be about 8 years old, and I had a horse and would ride quite a bit. And when he'd tell me about the jobs that he had to do on the way up, they had to swim some of the rivers and ford the cattle and get them all. It took them a long time, but it was so spectacular, it seemed to me, that I wanted to be a cowboy. Strickengust would look out through a little door that he had. It was an opening for the lines to come through, and he would drive there, and he would look sort of absent and begin a story about what he had to do. And when he got done with those stories, what I wanted to do was get out of the thing right away and get a horse and start being a cowboy. So I was practicing being a cowboy for the first 15 or 18 years of my life, and that proved to be quite a job too, because there were things to do, and there were things that my father was doing, because he, as a homesteader, had enlarged his business and had started to raise more grain and more cattle. So he would let me, I wanted to be a rancher, and I guess that's because I did become one. Because it's really a losing battle, it seems to me. If you've got to be a rancher, you've got to gotta be something better. And he would raise his produce and take it to town. Sometimes I'd go with him in his wagon when he took his potatoes and his apples to town, and we'd meet in the back of the Missoula Mercantile. That was a place that we'd meet. Everybody was real pleased to have Sam McClay come and visit a while, but when you look on the Gerald Avenue, excuse me, where all the good houses were and the people who were connected mostly with the railroad, they would live there, but they never invited anybody on a farm to be with them. As they used to say, we were nothing but farmers, and so we were welcome at the back end of the store whenever we had some groceries to sell, but we were not exactly welcome as among the society of Missoula. Missoula society was built mainly about the sale of ties and the contracts that the Northern Pacific made with quite a lot of people, and they made lots of money that way. And of course, they spent their money with their on their homes on Gerald Avenue. Gerald Avenue was one of the earliest and best streets of the whole town. And during my time, we could see that the whole of Missoula was practically vacant. To the east, there were many acres of land unused, and sometimes somebody would pasture a cow there and lead her from the home. The homes were mostly around Mount Avenue, and the Prescott family built their home over where the university proved to be. They built it there before the university was made, and that has been a story that has come through all these years. Well, it was a good experience to grow up on the ranch and ride a horse and have several horses and do the farm ranch work that I could do. And we did that for a long time. And as we did that, we would come to town for supplies, and usually I'd get a chance to come to town maybe once in 2 weeks, so that I would be acquainted with what's going on. And I remember very well that at about 5 years of age, I stood on the end of one of the streets. The main street had parking in it. What was that street? I've forgotten. And the street ended right where the river begun. And in 1910, I remember the flood going by, and over the Milwaukee Depot, all the Milwaukee tracks were all flooded.
Are you sure that was 1910?
Pardon?
Are you sure that was 1910?
1910.
1910.
And the bridge was washed out. There had been a cable put across for people to walk across. It was a pretty shaky thing you could see out there. But I remember seeing the debris floating by. Once in a while there would be pieces of a house, and plenty of logs and trees would float by. It was all one big scene of water from the end of that street clear across to where Higgins Avenue would be. And Higgins, the mercantile, had their place there far enough back so the high water didn't bother them, and they continued to grow. There were other things. They what do you call it? There was a hospital, Sisters Hospital, built in about the same place it's located now. That was, and then on the north end of the whole area was the steam legs that would come through, and we'd see them and hear them whistling at night when they'd pull in. They were pretty marginal things. They were steam engines that were piled up there. 3 or 4 steam engines were usually around in the Missoula depot, and they built that place on it for it. After a while, I'm losing my words, and I better stop now.
Okay. Seem to have
You
some,
covered a lot, my dear.
yeah, we seem to have some discrepancy in dates on the flood. It may have been 1908, it may have been 1910.
1908.
It was 1908.
It was 1908, okay.
Mhm.
You know, were you there in 1908? What did you think of that? Or was the Potomac Valley
I was
flooding
in the
too?
Potomac Valley, but my father wanted us to see this footbridge, so he brought us down, and we all walked across the footbridge. But I remember that was 1908,
1908.
and the big fire was in 1910.
Okay. What do you remember about that, Francis? Were you
Well, I don't remember.
You
I
don't
was
remember.
born in 1910.
19?
So you don't remember the fire, the
No.
big fire?
No.
Well, you mentioned earlier that your first memory was of, in a technical term today, harassing one of your neighborhood kids. Was this the childhood play that took place a lot?
Yes, that's all when you asked for early memory,
Yeah.
that popped into my mind, because I liked that little boy, and I just harassed him all the time.
Was that uncharacteristic for girls to do that to guys at that time?
I
or-
don't know. I don't know. We didn't have many children to play with. I had 2 older brothers, but I didn't have too many outside children to play with, so I was fascinated. I remember that.
Well, what kind of things did you do when you played? Did you have a lot of toys, or did you just make up your own?
Well, we had a coaster wagon that was very precious, and we didn't have tricycles. When my brothers were 12 or 14, they had bicycles, but I never had one. So when they were gone, I would take their bicycles and learn to ride them.
Did you ever crash?
Oh, and many times.
Okay.
Mm.
Well, Eunice, and you're growing up there in the Potomac Valley, I guess your way of getting around was horses and wagons. You mentioned an old wagon your family had.
Well, I had my wonderful Black Nellie saddle horse, and I used to ride with my family, my brother and my father and my uncle on the roundup after I was 10 years old. From then until I was through high school, I'd ride every year on the roundup with them. But my school days, you want that?
Sure.
Well, you asked about activities on the playground, and my greatest activity was playing marbles, and I still have some of the Aggies that I won. But my uncle was mad at me because I got all of his Aggies one day on the school ground, and he hit me here, and I still have the hole in my head. He hit me with a rock, threw a rock. There's a dent where he hit me. But we had a wonderful school and wonderful times, and I often think of the teacher teaching all 8th grades, one teacher teaching 8 grades, And what a wonderful teacher she was. And we always thought that our teacher was the greatest person in the whole world. I'm sorry now that some of the parents in the schools are not cooperative with the schools and the teachers. A few of them are not. But in my day, we thought our teacher was the greatest person that ever walked. And I think she was, because she handled 8th grades. My sister and I came down here to high school at the same time, and we're from a poor school, you might say, because only one teacher. And she was on the honor roll. I wasn't. I was playing too much. But she was on the honor roll all the time. We were in high school. So we must have had a good 8th grade teacher. But she probably didn't teach me as much because I was playing around too much.
What kind of play, if you don't mind my asking?
All kinds of different things with the students, and I was the busybody all the life. And my sister never rode horses, and I had 2 horses, and they were really mine, Black Nellie and Blossom. And when I wore one of them out, I just take the other one. And I had a real good life.
Did you ever partake in livestock roaming through Missoula? Did that ever happen while you were?
No, we didn't have anything of that kind. Of course, my folks, I'll have to tell you one thing about the livestock. A fellow at the Potomac, well, he's out of Potomac, he had a little ranch, and he was a Quaker, and he was going back to be with his folks in Pennsylvania. And so he was selling his ranch, and he came to our house, and he said, "I have something to give ye. Ye are such a cute little girl. I want to give ye a present." Well, I waited and waited, and he didn't come with a present, but finally he came in a lumber wagon, and he brought me a little blue Mustang colt and a little heifer calf. Oh, I was so thrilled with him. And he said, "These are because ye are such a cute little girl." So the heifer calf grew to be a cow, and she had a little calf. And I said to my father one day, "How much could I get for my cow?" And he said, "Oh, I think about $35. And so a butcher, we always said the butcher came, the fellow came riding up to Patone to get cattle. And he said, "Is your father at home?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, I came up to buy cattle. I heard he had some cattle for sale." And I said, "But I have a cow for sale." And he said, "How much do you want for it?" I said, "My dad said she was worth $35, so I will take $35 for her." So I got on my saddle horse, we rode down to the corral, and she was in the corral this day with her little calf. He said, "Do you want to sell the calf too?" And I said, "No, I'm keeping the calf, I'm giving it to my father for the cow's keep." He gave me the $35, and I went into the house and took the first $35 with me and looked at it, and I thought, "Now what am I going to buy with it?" "Oh, I know what I'll buy. I'll send for a phonograph." Nobody in the valley had a phonograph. But I'd look in the catalogs and I'd just think what a wonderful thing it would be to have a phonograph.
You remember the 1908 flood, fire too, don't you?
Mm-hmm. That was
Well, how it got so smoky.
That was 1910.
1910
Mm-hmm.
was the fire.
Yes.
1908 was the flood, is that right?
That's right.
1908 was the flood. I have to correct that because that's when it was, and that's when I was there to see it. And 1910 was the fire, and it was so smoky at the ranch. It was so smoky that the chickens wouldn't get off the perch during the daytime.
David,
And
Eunice is telling her story. You let her finish.
oh, excuse me.
Well, that's all right.
Go ahead. What did you wind up get? Did you buy the phonograph?
Well, then I went in the house and wrote an order for a phonograph. And I was 12 years old. And I got on my saddle horse, went up to the post office, and I said, "I'd like to buy a money order." And the postmistress said, "For what?" I said, "I'm sending for a phonograph." She said, "A phonograph? Do your people know that you're doing this?" I said, "No, they wouldn't let me do it if they knew it. So they weren't at home." And she said, "I can't write you a money order." She said, "You should tell your parents about this because you folks need things a lot better than a phonograph. You don't need a phonograph. I said, well, anyway, I want to send for a phonograph. No, I felt so dejected when she told me that she wouldn't write the money order. And Mr. Olson said, now that was her cow, and if you won't write that money order, I will. So he went back to the post office. They had a store, and they were both in the store. But he went back to the post office, wrote me a money order. I sent for the phonograph with 12 records, and I still had $3.50 left. And oh, I felt so happy about it. My folks came home, and I told my dad that I sold my cow, and he said, you sold your cow? I said, he said, how much did you get for it? I said, $35. Oh, he said, you shouldn't have sold her for $35. My mother said, now listen, I heard you tell her that's what it was worth. And don't scold her. Don't scold her because she sold it too cheap. Well, we got the phonograph. My dad was a step dancer, and he'd go to the dances, and they'd always say, we're having time out now for Billy Morris to do a step dance. So I was very sure that I ordered 4 records, step dance records, because I thought my dad wouldn't scold me so much when the phonograph came. Oh, he loved it. He loved the phonograph, he loved it. He learned new step dances. He would put Arthur Murray to, well, he just was better than anybody you could ever imagine. He'd scrape the floor and jump in the air, and all the time his feet were going. Oh, we just thought our dad was a great one. So anyway, then my mother started inviting all the people of our ages, my sisters and my age. Am I talking too long?
Oh, you're doing fine.
She would invite the people from Sunday school, my sister's age and my age, after Sunday school. They always knew that they were coming to our house to dinner and listen to the phonograph, because we had the only one in the valley. Oh, everybody loved it. They just thought it was wonderful. And my dad got so he learned all kinds of new steps, and he loved it more than all the kids in the valley. But we just all had such a wonderful time. Mother she'd boil a ham. We didn't bake ham in those days. We boiled ham. And she'd have bread and ham and potato salad and some kind of dessert for the people who came from Sunday school. And then they'd pool their money. And one would say, I have 5 cents, and somebody else would say, I have 15 cents. And they'd pool their money, and we'd get another 1 or 2 records. So the records built up from our pooling the money with all the Sunday school people who were my age, and we just had a wonderful time with that phonograph.
Were the phonographs, were the records the round ones, the cylinders?
The cylinder records, yes. And the one that I'm hoping will be played at my funeral is Moonlight and Roses by Will Oakland. I can hear that yet. The Moonlight and Roses by Will Oakland, Edison record. I can always hear that, Edison record.
Well, how long did it take the phonograph, when you sent your letter off with the cashier's check or the money order for the phonograph, how long did it take for the phonograph to come back?
When we ordered it?
Yeah.
About a month.
About a month.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it came pretty fast. We thought it came quite fast.
Okay. In all this dancing and goofing around or whatever you did at that time, who do you think was the wildest person around town at the time? Was there some
The wildest?
the wildest person around town?
We didn't have many wild people then. We had lumberjacks and ranchers, and they'd all get on and drunk on Saturday night, but they all stayed at the saloons. They didn't ramble around any place. But we would never dance with a fellow if he'd been drinking. So any times we went to a dance, the fellow wanted to go to the dance, he'd never dared take a drink. And that was the Mr. Smith who owned the hotel, and that was Frank Smith, who had the first automobile in Missoula. He and another fellow, and I don't remember the other fellow's name, but Frank Smith owned the first automobile that ever came into Missoula. And he had a hotel and a store and a saloon and a post office in Potomac. So he gave us all a ride in this first car that ever came into Missoula.
You remember what kind it was?
No, I really don't.
Francis, you remember the first car you had a ride in?
Yes, it was my Uncle George Beckwith from St. Ignatius. He had a car. Our family didn't have a car. My father died when I was 8 years old, and we sort of had rough sledding from then on. But I was spent many years at St. Ignatius. I spent my summers there, rather, after my father died. And my Uncle George had the mercantile store in the Beckwith Mercantile in St. Ignatius. So he had an open, well, it had, I don't know what the make of the car was, but it was, it held 7 people, 3 people in back and 2 in front, and then 2 on the jump seats. And I was always on the jump seat, I remember that. But it was open, the lid come over when it rained, but it was always unlidded, I guess. And that's the first car I remember very distinctly.
What year was that, do you remember?
Well, it must have been 1918, 19.
Okay. Well, David, you must have had a first automobile after you got out of college. You went to botany school, is that correct?
Well, I remember Civil War veteran Perry McLean had a Ford that would run pretty well, and he came by and gave me a short ride. My Uncle Bill had settled across the present McClay Bridge in that big house, and he bought another kind of car. I think it was a Studebaker with an awful long engine, and he came and took us for a ride once in a while. He'd come and stay for the Sunday dinner, and then of course he'd have to take us for a ride. And it was an open car, and there were no doors on it. You had to be careful you didn't fall out. And he would drive along. The old highway wasn't such a highway then. It was located up on the bench from where it is now, and from Lolo on through the country, it was just a gravel road and subject to the ups and downs, little hills and turns whenever somebody had a section or quarter section he didn't want the road in, they moved the road over. And the road used to be right in front of the house, and my mother wanted a little ways away, so they moved the road down about 600 feet, and that's where it stayed until after they built the new one down along the railroad.
When you were what year were you in college here at the University of Montana?
College? Well, I went through the high school and finished in 1923 and went then to the university. We all did, all of our family went through the university, and I graduated, started in 1924 and went through to 1927, and I graduated as a biologist. But that didn't seem to do me much good. I went back to the ranch and wanted to be a rancher, so I guess I forgot about the education for about 7 or 8 years until times were so tough that we couldn't make any money. We couldn't sell anything. All the grain was in the granaries, and no sale for them, no sale for the cattle. Cattle were, if they did sell, they were sold for 12.5 a piece, a pair, and sheep were about $2 a piece. Pigs were 50 cents a piece, and the grain was less than than it cost. It must have cost about a cent a pound to raise, but it was sold for 27 cents a bushel delivered in Missoula. That's when the bank took it over in our ranch. That's when we briefly lost the ranch, and we were all living there. The girls had grown and got jobs elsewhere, but my brother and my dad and mother, we all lived there at the big house and tried to make ends meet. But that was the days when you had to be a Democrat or you get starved if you weren't voluble about that. If you were a Republican, you would have to do without food too. And but fortunately there were a lot of wildlife, a lot of deer. We had venison all through one winter, and my mother would make something out of even the ribs of venison, and nobody ever eats, but we ate them then. She'd make them up into something that was better. But we got all through that winter, and a fellow named Fred, they wintered with us. He didn't have any money and didn't need any, so he wintered with us, and we had a few chickens and turkeys, and we ate those at times. But we'd eat venison. When we got all through the winter and spring started to spring, I said to Fred one day, that was pretty nice meat, that venison all winter. He said, no, I don't like that venison very well. He had it all winter, so he had enough of it. But that was another story. We went along, and nobody would buy the ranch. The bank took it over, and they had people handling it, but nobody would buy it. So I think they valued it at $60,000 for the whole ranch, which was about a 3,000-acre place at the time. And so there we made applications to the different kinds of lending organizations, and there wasn't anybody liberal enough to pass us through the application, because we were kind of hard people to handle. We were not Democrats, and we wouldn't get in to see that. And so the inspector came to see us, and he wrote a letter to the effect that anybody who would lend money to those two boys would be crazy, and so they turned us down. And that was in 1932. And when my brother had written to a cousin who lived in the east in Massachusetts, and he happened to be a roommate of the man who was at that time the head of the lending agency that the government was supposed to be taking care of. And when those people got together, the man who was head of the RACC, it was called, they changed it around, and they loaned us about $3,000 that helped to put us into gear, and so we retained the ranch, and we paid some of the taxes and got squared away again during the bad of the Depression.
Eunice, you were here at that time, and you had been on a ranch. How did it affect the people in Potomac, and how did depression affect the people in Missoula in general? Can you talk about that?
The Depression.
I think the people in Potomac probably were wonderful people, so far as I knew. We never heard of a divorce, and whenever there was a death, everybody was so solicitous, and they'd all come with food and flowers and everything that they could think of. And they'd do so much for you. I think that few people do that yet, but it was a wonderful valley. And I suppose that there were people who quarreled or something like that, but as children, we never heard about it.
Mm.
And I lived there until I was ready for high school. So I was 18 years old when I graduated from high school. I was probably 14 years old when I started. And during those 14 years of my life, I thought the people of the valley were wonderful, wonderful people. We never heard of any murders or we never had a key to our doors. I never remember ever seeing a key. We could go on trips and go to the circus or any place else that we wanted to go. That was our main, as children, that was the main thing we did. But we came to different things that happened. My father we had a weekly newspaper, and he'd read about something that was coming up in Missoula, and he felt that his family should enter into it, and we always came. Like the first airplane and the first, we came down to the maypole dancing at the university. Well, that was a big event in those days. And so, in my growing up life, I think I had wonderful parents who didn't come to town only when there was something special, except to buy groceries or something like that. And we had 10 acres of potatoes on a homestead. My father I was taken to a homestead after I was born, and lived at the homestead until I was 8 years old. And then we bought the ranch, and then we kept buying more property. We finally had a big ranch.
Now, during the Depression, you were in Missoula,
Yes.
and interesting question might be is, did it affect the people on the ranches, as Dave talked about, as the same way it did in Missoula, or what was the difference between living in the city and living out on a ranch at that time?
Well, living in the city during the Depression, everything was unbalanced. The groceries were so high, and the jobs were scarce, and everything was out of balance. And living on a ranch, the Depression was bad too, but we had food. You could hardly buy food during the Depression. You could hardly afford to buy meat. I mean, just ordinary working people. And I was a school teacher, and I was an ordinary working person, starting at a job at $90 a month, and paying probably for a pound of hamburger, we'd pay $1 a pound or maybe more during the Depression. So you see the balance of the salaries and the food and and clothing was so expensive. The Depression was certainly unbalanced between the two.
Mm-hmm. Missoula was at that time agriculture, ranching, logging, and the education system mostly. Francis, do you remember what the impact on the logging industry was during the Depression here?
I was very close to the logging industry because Mr. Baird, who was a logger, Harper and Baird were the great loggers in this section, and my sister married Mr. Baird's daughter. My sister married Baird's son. Get things kind of mixed up, don't they? But anyway, we knew them, we knew all the loggers, and we were very well acquainted with Don McKenzie. He was a real good friend of ours, and he was the superintendent of the logging in the Blackfoot. And then they moved the logging from the Blackfoot down to 9 Mile, and I remember going on the train down to 9 Mile to a lot of functions, especially we used to have big rallies during election time, and all people gathered and had all dinners and everything else during that time. I suppose they do now, probably not like they did then.
But let me ask Francis, Did you see a major difference in the logging operations since forestry and logging in Montana, western Montana was so important to the economy? Did that slow down or did it just keep going?
My grandfather was the superintendent of the mill in Hamilton, and that's why he came from Wisconsin to Montana just for the logging business. And he was superintendent of the mill in Hamilton until they cut out the Bitterroot Valley, and I think it was about 1930. Oh, let's see, I don't know when, but it must have been around 1930 that they closed the mill in Hamilton and moved it all to Bonner. And at that time, he retired as superintendent, but he was 75 at that time. I think he was 78 at that time because he died when in 1934. He was, I do remember going up to Hamilton to visit him when we were children. And later, when he retired from the mill, he was mayor of Hamilton for several years. And he lined us, there were 6 grandchildren. He lined us all up and shook his finger at us and said, if you do anything wrong in this town of Hamilton, I'll put you in jail. So I can remember that very, very well. We weren't to put any gum wrappers or anything, do anything to disrespectful to the city of Hamilton. And then about the logging or the timber, I don't really know anything except that my brother Dwight was with the ACM company all his working years, and he really loved his.
I will have to be excused for a minute.
Okay.
For a
I don't
couple of
know.
minutes.
My father was involved in the timber business. He was worked for the big Blackfoot company originally, but then settled in Butte with his own coal and lumber business. And he had a partner, Mr. Herrick from St. Mary's, Idaho, over there, who urged him into this business in Butte, and he was doing well there. We lived there about 4 years when he died. He died unexpectedly of a ruptured appendix, and in 1918 they did not have all the miracle drugs they have now to fight infections. But so then my mother sold the business and we moved back to Missoula. But my grandfather was the main logger in our family.
Eunice, do you remember the Depression at all? How did the Depression affect you?
Oh, I remember the Depression well, because you see, I was grown up then. I was in Missoula, I was living in Missoula during the Depression.
You were still employed though?
I was still what?
Employed. You still had a job during the
Oh, yes,
Depression?
I was teaching at the Bonner School during the Depression, but living in Missoula, where everything was unbalanced. Salaries and what you had to pay for everything.
Mhm.
It was a bad time. It was a bad time for ranchers, a bad time for people who had borrowed money. The banks were going to foreclose on them. Fortunately, my father wasn't one of it, my uncle was. And the bank was going to close it on his mortgage, and C.H. McLeod said, Ben, you'll never have anybody close on that mortgage, foreclose on that mortgage. We're going to help you. So we knew C.H. McLeod very well through my family, and he was he was the head of the Missoula Mercantile Company.
During the Depression, one of the major things happening here, especially at Fort Missoula, was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCCs.
Was what?
The CCCs, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
You see, people criticize the CCCs, but they had jobs, and a lot of those people, there was no such a thing as a food bank or anything like that in those days, and some of the people would just be out in the cold without food, and there were some of them.
Mm-hmm.
But the CCC saved those. And at that time, people were criticizing them. They'd say, oh, they're just leaning on their shovels and doing this and that. But I think it was a good thing. I think it was a wonderful thing. I really do.
We've been talking about World War II and what went on there. One of the things, Eunice, you and I talked about earlier was your birthday being December 8th. And what happened on December 8th, 1941? You celebrated your birthday. What was that like?
The Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Pearl Harbor. I remember on my birthday getting up and looking at the paper and the great big headlines, Pearl Harbor. I'll never forget that date. It was a sad time for everybody. Reading such horror as we read in the paper that day. We didn't have TVs in that time. That is, I guess maybe somebody. I don't think there were TVs in. I'm sure there were.
Did you do anything different on your birthday because of that?
Yes. Some friends of mine were going to have a party that day for me. And I said, we're all so sad today about Pearl Harbor. Let's just postpone the date of the birthday party. And they said, well, I think that'd be a good idea. I said, I think in respect for those people who have been killed, I don't think we should be partying. They said, I think you're right. So they canceled my birthday party. I remember that very, very well. And we all felt so bad about it, about the Pearl Harbor. So I'll always remember that date.
Francis, where were you at the start of World War
Oh,
II?
wasn't it December 7th?
Yes.
Yes, December 7th, the day before my birthday.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember the terrific shock of being, you know, the stories in the papers were terrific. And then my brothers and I had many acquaintances and friends, dear friends, in the Philippines that were invaded and bombed. And several of them were interned for the duration, you know, by the Japanese. And it was just a terrible, unbelievable event. But none of my family, immediate family, were in the Army. My brothers, my one brother was with the Navy as an aviator, and my older brother was not able to be in the service because he was too tall. He was 5 feet 6.5 inches tall, and they just don't take him that way. And he had also asthma. He was very subject to asthma attacks, which knocked him out. And so we had so many dear friends in the Army, and the casualties were severe. It was a sad, sad time. And for us, David was too old to go in the Army, but he left the Forest Service to go to the ranch, his beloved ranch, to work for the war effort. And that's where we were moved from Helena. We were there temporarily with the Forest Service to move to Missoula and to the ranch. So we were involved in it that way. And I remember David and his brother put in potatoes, and they needed potatoes. So I remember potatoes up to here.
And David, how were things in the ranching business during the war?
Well, during the war, I was frozen, supposedly, where I had the job with the Forest Service, but I said I'm going anyway, and when I went back to the ranch, we resumed some of the things that we were doing, and then came they had the War Production Board and the BPA and other kinds of alphabet, and there was a fellow came out and said that the War Production wanted to have 30 acres of potatoes in our place. And so we agreed that if that's the way they want it for the war, we will do it. So we arranged to plant the 30 acres, and meantime there were many carloads of tractors going by to the coast and for shipment. They were tractors with tires and starters and so forth, but a rancher couldn't buy a tractor with a starter and lights. So we couldn't use the tractor with the lugs to chop up the potatoes. And so they promised they would help us in Helena. They had the two offices that faced each other in Helena, and none of them could get anything done about getting tires on the tractor, so we had to rely on Mexican nationals that they brought through the war production, and the Mexican nationals didn't much like to work when they were out chopping weeds. They were leaning on their toes, on their holes most of the time, and that didn't please me. So they had an interpreter coming along. He came, and Ted came with his car. I said, well, Ted, if you got a place to put these, you take them, or if you don't take them, I'm going to kill one of them. They're not doing any work. And so they understood what I was saying in English, and they dropped their hose and went and got in that car in quick like. So from there on, we didn't have any weed work done on the potatoes, and yet there were a good many hundreds of pounds. I think we finally gathered about 2 carloads of potatoes, and we had to put them through a grader, and then we had to put them in new sacks. I think the sacks cost us 27 cents, and then we had to have them inspected. But while that was going on, they said, let them know, and they'd set a car out on the local line so that we can load a car load. We had 2 of them ready, and they were in the sunlight and getting green pretty fast. So they had a man come out from Missoula to tell us that the government didn't want them at any price. They promised us 2 cents a pound for them if we got them all done, but they didn't want them at any price. And we had all those 30 acres of potatoes to dispose of. we had to truck them to Hamilton and sell them to one of the processors up there for 95 cents a hundred. So that was our experience with the War Production Board, and I made up my mind that they didn't care anything about the fellow who did it, so I guess I'll just have to go ahead and do what I can. And so from there on, we had to depend on the black market for repairs for our tractors and our machinery. Everybody was doing something sub rosa, and it was one of those times. I think that developed that induced most of the people who wanted to do anything, any business, had to begin to lie about the whole thing, and I thought that was just terrible. You had to lie in order to get anything produced, and when you did, somebody was going to say, well, it's only worth 95 cents, or it's only worth something. But we had, they even stopped, reduced the value of pork at the sales. That was a top too. You couldn't get above that, and the price of the cattle was held too, so that everybody was kind of miffed about the whole thing. Well, I was still employed by the Forest Service and the federal services when the Second War was going on, and the Second War hadn't started yet. I was at the mouth of the Columbia River where the big dam is located, and I was in conjunction with another biologist who came from Portland, and the question was, were there any salmon, the returning salmon, turned up the Columbia River in lieu of the snake? So we had quite a little conference there, and we looked at the fish when they came through Bonneville Dam, and we were up there, and we concluded, and I reported, that about 20% of the returning mature salmon had come to spawn. They were turning up the Columbia River. And I reported that. That letter went to Washington, and it was kicked around, and then came the word that I had to redo the letter. There were no salmon turned up the Columbia, and I refused to lie about it, so I thought they would fire me, but they didn't. But that's when the Second War started. President Roosevelt stopped any salmon that went up. He went ahead and built that big dam, and in order to have that dam, they had to have that to produce the kind of poison that goes along with the bomb. Some of the, I don't know what the name of that is now, but I know I was pretty disgusted with the whole thing. Here we were, trying to do what we could, and there they were building a big dam, and when they got it built, they could produce the atomic bomb by getting the right kind of poison and running stuff through that high dam. Well, I never did get over that. There were times when you wondered what the devil they were doing. Here, the report was that the Secretary of Interior was on a horseback trip in the park in New York. He was enjoying a drive there, and the airplane flight, the Japs had figured it all out. They came in, and all of those people were there, and all those ships were there in Pearl Harbor, and it pretty near wiped out the American strength. And those people, in the course of time, Shorts and another one, those people were persecuted throughout their lives, and the fall guys were those people who were in the Army leadership, and I thought it was the President Roosevelt himself who created the Second War on that particular action. He had to get the Columbia free, so he'd be free to build the dam. And in order to get free, he had to overcome those people who wanted to be good to the wildlife and go ahead. I never did get over that. I still wonder how a Democrat can stay a Democrat if he knows all the history of all this stuff. And when you analyze them, you know darn well that if the fellow answers in some proper way, he cannot, in good conscience, remain a Democrat, because they're spin-off really from the original Republican handling of the Constitution. One of my great-grandfathers.
David, we're getting a little bit off of Missoula here and into a lot of politics national. We want to stick with Missoula and see what's happening here.
Gotta get in Missoula.
Got to get to Missoula. One area that was brought up earlier was what happened to some cattle during World War II. There was a lifting of cattle. What do you call it in those days? Rustling? Did that ever take place in Missoula?
What happened where?
Cattle rustling.
Cattle rustling. Did that take place in Missoula? Or in the Missoula area?
This area?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had the felons from the Army at the fort. They were concentrated here while we were trying to take care of the ranch, and some way or other they didn't keep the gates shut, and they let those people out 2 at a time, and they would come. Francis and I were living up there across the river raising some turkeys. We had 1,000 turkeys we were taking care of, and I was taking care of the cattle ostensibly, but they were still stealing them. And we had word from across on the west side that there were people loose running through the river bottom, and it seemed to be a pretty tight proposition. Those people were without any direction. The fort people had let them go, and apparently it got to be a pretty serious thing. A couple of guys would go out when the gate was not shut, and they'd steal a couple of horses and saddles, and they'd ride up the country, and the Army in charge of it would try to find them, but they couldn't find them. And of course it was all on the radio that those people were loose, and one evening there was army outfit came along the river, and I forded the river to find out what they wanted. And that one was one of the lieutenants. He wanted me to go with him and alert all these people in the valley about those people who were loose and they might be dangerous. So I went along with him, and we went and knocked on doors, and nobody would answer. People who lived in that river bottom were under the bed, or they were hiding somewhere. They wouldn't answer the door. They thought it was the real thing. So we came back, and we didn't accomplish very much. And those people who were loose, they got away, and a couple of them got a little hungry, and they went to the next place, my uncle's place, and uncle's gone. So they looked around and found a pass key, got into the house, and then they tried some keys they found in a kitchen drawer. That opened up a roll-top desk, and they opened up the roll-top desk and found a little tin box that was just plumb full of tens and twenties, and they took that all with them and got something to eat, and then they went out under a pine tree and divided it, those two guys. The war was going on, and this fella, these people, they just cleared the head of the valley, and they got a couple of motorcycles, and they got a couple of blondes that they liked, and they were riding with them down in I think it was Indiana, and they got apprehended, and when they got them and collared them, took them back here for a trial, they didn't have any money. I guess they sought for money. So I asked my uncle when I saw him next. He took a big headline in the paper. Those people got away with about $10,000 he had. He said, well, it seemed like a time we didn't get down to the bank, and the stuff piled up there. And I said, didn't you get anything? He said, I got this watch. That's what he got out of $10,000.
Yeah.
So that's the experience that we had in Missoula. Those people, I complained to a pretty high up Democrat a while back, and I thought maybe they ought to shut the gate once in a while. And he was a big name, I guess, in it. So in the course of about a week, they had a different commandant, and they did shut the gates, and there were no more of those felons getting loose for quite a while. I made up my mind if one of them came to me at night, I had a shotgun and I would kill him, and then we'd ask some questions later if he was a stranger. But I didn't have to. He didn't come.
Okay. You were there, Francis. How did all this affect you, World War II and Fort Missoula and the prisoners being there? And what about the Japanese and the Italians?
We were really nervous about these escapees, and some of them did come, but we didn't have the bridge then. David built a
Didn't have a
bridge
bridge.
over the river, but you had to ford the river, and the I don't know where they came from, but they sauntered through the valley, these prisoners, and one went up to the ranch. Two of them went up to the ranch, and they accosted the ranch hand's wife and they ordered her to feed them, which she did. And then she slipped out her back door and said that she had to bring in the laundry or do something, but she slipped out and went over to the house where the telephone was and phoned these, and pretty soon the people from the fort came and
The captain came.
they got them. But that was a harrowing experience for her and for, we were on the other side, on the east side of the river, raising turkeys, and it was a nervous time. We had Anne, our eldest child, was only 2 at that time, and I didn't like it a bit.
If you want to do something that isn't worthwhile, try raising the turkeys or try ranching. You can,
Yeah.
you can
You can
find,
have a lot of
you can find a dead
experiences.
end pretty soon
Yeah.
if you want to.
We ordered 500 turkeys that time, and of course I had never even seen anything except a turkey all dressed for Thanksgiving dinner table. But we dipped their beaks, and then as they grew older, we'd count them. They'd roost all over everything. And David would go out and count, and he'd say, well, there's more than 500. I got 750 or something. So then I'd go out and, with the lantern and count the turkeys. And I get a far different number than David got. We never knew, but we marketed over 650 turkeys, and we only ordered 500.
And then we got, was bought 1,000 the next year and raised them.
It was profitable though.
Well, they were different. They weren't the little skinny-breasted ones. They were the broad-breasted ones, brand new, introduced into Missoula, and people went nuts about them. They paid real good money to us, and that's how we put the down payment on this house. We
Turkey
sold
money bought this house.
We had the down payment for this, and that went on, that was from spring on till fall and winter, and the woman said she'd wait, so we paid the 2,000 down, and then I had no basis for credit. You have to, I guess, you have to grow up and you have to have credit on some kinds of record, but we had always either paid or failed to pay, and so I had no basis. So I kept asking the banks. No, they didn't want to lend, but there was an old retired fellow from Building and Loan across the river, across the across the street here, said, he said, well, I'll go down. He said, I'll go down and tell them a thing or two. So he went down and told them, and then there wasn't anybody lending the money. She wanted all of her money, and we couldn't supply it. But he talked to the man who was then head of the health department of the state of Missoula.
Dr. Pease was his name.
Yeah, you named him.
Yes, I did, purposely. He was a
Yeah.
wonderful man. He was the health officer here.
He was a friend of mine. I was a,
Pardon?
He came all the way up the mountain.
it was
when I had
great. He
rheumatic
loaned
fever.
us the
Yeah.
money,
Oh,
and we paid the old gal all the money she wanted, and we had this house free and clear with a debt. And that fellow, he was my friend the rest of his life. When he died, they had me as a pallbearer. He thought I was all right. But
Eunice, you recognize Dr. Pease's name. Was he a veterinarian or?
Dr.
what?
Pease, I had rheumatic fever when I was 12 years old, and Dr. Pease came all the way from Missoula up to Blackfoot, 25 miles with a horse and buggy, and he was the one who, at first he thought I had spinal meningitis, but later he found out that it probably rheumatic fever, and I was in bed a whole year because I had a very bad heart problem. And he said, if you don't keep her in bed, she will not live. So I knew Dr. Pease and loved him very much. He'd always take me in his arms and hug me and kiss me, and he'd say, oh, you're such a darling little girl. I hate to see you suffering like this. But I did suffer. But now, at this time, I have not one speck of arthritis or rheumatism. I just outgrew it, old age.
Mhm. Well, during World War II, what were you doing, what were the people in Missoula doing for entertainment? Were there theaters open, or was it all war
I don't-
movies, or what?
I don't remember the entertainment, but I remember making bandages and all kinds of things for the soldiers and shipping them overseas. And I don't remember the entertainment. But I do remember the entertainment at the old Harnois Theater, where I used to stand in line from 5 o'clock until 8 to
Well,
get
where was that?
It was on East Front Street. It was a wonderful, wonderful building, and they had wonderful shows. And the shows were very expensive, from $10 to $20 a ticket. And they had all the people, Pavlova, and all the dancers and singers and different people. We saw Mary Pickford came, and her boyfriend, actor friend. I don't remember who he was, but I remember Mary Pickford. But the people in my category would pay $4 to get to Nigger Heaven, and Nigger Heaven was on the third floor of the Harnois Theater. But the downstairs tickets were very, very expensive, and we couldn't afford that. So we'd stand in line. One night, one of our chums had a brand new suit, and he said, oh, Marguerite, you look beautiful in your new suit. And people were just standing there in line for such a long time, they'd saunter back and forth because of getting tired. And so somebody pushed her a little bit ahead of this fellow, and he pulled on her sleeve and tore the sleeve out of her new suit.
Okay.
But the Harnois Theater was a very wonderful, wonderful theater,
Mhm.
beautifully decorated, and I remember several of the theaters of olden times. And the Wilma Theater, the night the Wilma opened, was on the 4th of July. We all came in with our formal dresses, and those was a big opening and wonderful thing. They were going to have a dinner down at, they had a big restaurant down in the basement of the Wilma. And we were all dressed up in our finery, going to the restaurant afterwards. We came out of the theater, and there was 4 inches of snow on the 4th of July.
What year was this?
I can't remember.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the end of World War II.
I'd like to inject something, if I may, about growing up and my parents. One was a Scottish girl from Scotland, and she was of the I guess of the what do you call it? If they're little princesses, that's what they were when they were turned out. But my father was successful as a rancher, and while he was at it, he didn't find any income from any other place but his raising crops and selling them. And what he did, and my mother together, they sent us, there were 6 of us in the family, and there were 7, one of them died with diphtheria, but there were 6 of us matured, and the family, the couple sent us to the grade schools, to high school, and through the university, all on one rancher's income. And I thought that should be noted because that is outstanding. Anybody who does that on a ranch is a kind of an angel. He doesn't know that he can do that, but he did it. And when we were, all of us with degrees through the university here, and for 20 years during that time we were undergraduates. There was somebody named McClay in the undergraduate, and all of us got all the way through. I think that was an outstanding thing for any rancher to be doing.
Let's get on to the end of World War II, 1945, and two things probably are significant. One of them is what happened, what was things like when FDR passed away, and the second was about Victory in Europe Day. You know, Francis, let's start with you. What did you think about FDR's death at the time and Harry Truman coming in, and then what did you think about Victory in Europe Day?
Well, I don't remember much about FDR because I wasn't a special admirer of his. But it was a tremendous relief to have the war over, you know, and but it was Truman when the war ended, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And I was a great admirer of General MacArthur, and it was a great relief to have the war over. But we were still sort of floundering around on the ranch and involved with that, and I just wasn't, as I said, we had no immediate people in the Army, and it didn't involve me very much. It was times were a little rocky.
Eunice, your opinion or your thoughts about the end of the war and FDR's passing away and
Well, I remember very distinctly when we were I was at the ranch. I was up to my father's ranch. I was living in Missoula, but I just happened to be at the ranch. And before we got the news of the war ending, we heard the whistles from 25 miles away at the Bonner Mill. I remember that distinctly. And my father said it must be the end of the war because we could never hear anything like that. But I wasn't living at home, but I was visiting at my father's home. And anyway, I remember the wonderful things that happened after the war. People who had lost loved ones, everybody went to them after the war was over and gave them sympathy and everything. Of course, that's all we could give. But it was a very, very trying time to think that some of the ones, and many of my students that I had in the Bonner School were killed during that war. And I have scrapbooks, all the ones that I knew, and the pictures that were in the paper, and a lot of other things about World War II in my scrapbook.
David, what was your impression, or where were you, and what did you remember most about the end of World War II, FDR's death, and Victory in Europe Day?
Well, the end of World War II was considerable relief for me because there was a whole string of things that were being done wrong, I thought. It was a time when maybe we could get something better done in our local politics and in our local county. And I was pretty well involved in the politics of the county. I was a member of the committee of 10 that they had all through that time. And we had some people who were chairman of them. I didn't think they were doing very much good, and I thought it'd be a good idea if we would enlarge what we were doing and try to bring better attitudes to the people who were voting and keeping people in. There were examples of stuff going on during World War II that were awful. Couple of county commissioners thought it'd be a good idea to get a freezer for nothing, and we get a lot of food for nothing. I don't know what they were doing up on Rattlesnake, and they had to lock the door up to keep from the commissioners from taking the food out of the place for feeding the indigents who were there. And that woman, she was convinced that they better stop that, so she locked up the thing and they couldn't get it. But there had to be some changes, and so I made myself busy, and I guess I, in a sense, led the committee. I wasn't chairman of it, and I didn't want to be, but the chairman, it seemed to me, wasn't doing enough, and we better get at it. So we started out to find people who were better qualified to take care of the county. And in the rundown, I guess I should say that we shut off a lot of people who were not the right kind of people, wouldn't do it, and we got some pretty good people in the commissioner's office, and then it went downhill, and we had to do something about it. I think one of the best moves that we've ever made is to find a person who is qualified as a biologist and qualified also as an engineer. And I thought it was important to take that fellow up and not fail to let him down. And so I went to work on it, and I spent a little money on it, and I advertised that, and I had him sitting right there where you are, and he answered the questions right up front, just like any Republican answers, and I thought, well, my God, here we got a fellow who is not only qualified, but he is a Republican. So I guess I induced him to file, and I did the best I could. But he called me on the evening when it was about ready to close down the chance to file, and he said, I filed, but I filed as a Republican.
No.
I said, well, you bastard, what I gotta do is go to work now, I guess.
David, he said he filed as a Democrat.
As a Democrat.
Yes.
I should have said that. He filed as a Democrat.
Well, when was this?
Huh?
When was this?
When? That was the beginning of the last election.
Oh, just last year?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We jumped way ahead of ourselves
I
here.
know.
Beginning
Okay.
of the last
He
election.
has his mind set on something.
Okay.
He cannot change
Okay.
it.
He
Well,
filed
let's
as a
get back.
Democrat.
Okay, let's get back to the end of World War II. Just briefly, and we'll start with you, Eunice. What was the biggest impression you had, or the most memorable thing that happened during 1945 towards the end of the war?
45.
1945 towards the end of the war. What was going on in your mind? What were your thoughts about that?
That's when the war ended.
Yeah.
Well, the biggest impression was to comfort the people who had lost loved ones. I think everybody was just so sad about. I lost loved ones, my cousin and an uncle in World War II, and everybody was so supportive. But the biggest, well, another thing was getting back to order and working and doing the things that we'd always done. Everybody was stirred up so during the war. Their jobs and their homes and everything else. Everybody was concerned. All people, all they were talking about was the war. And when the war was over, it seemed like the people got settled down, and the sad people had to go back to their lives. That was my most impressive memory.
Okay. Lawrence or Francis?
My,
Let's let Francis have a turn here.
I was busy having babies about that time. And this would be 1945.
Right.
Well, like Eunice said, the people came back from the war, and I remember there was a tailor boy, lived in the next block, and we had a real hoop-de-doo parade for him when he came back. And it was a resettling time. People were, just had been disrupted. It didn't happen in our family, but all your neighbors, all your friends, some of my good friends had their husbands were back since first time in 4 years or something like that, and it was a welcome home, sort of atmosphere. Everybody was happy to have it all over with, and it was not sort of an unsettling time too.
Because of the people who
I think one of my most concerns was that the government, the processes of government locally had fallen apart. They had fallen apart nationally too, but I wanted to do something about it. It kept me concerned that I kept trying to find people who were qualified to go to these different offices, and I don't know, I think there's been a little difference made as we went along, and that was after the World War II. That there were a lot of things that weren't going right, and I thought we'd better get something done.
Okay. Is there anything that you guys would like to say? We're getting close to the end here. Is there anything you guys would like to say about the period between, the Depression and the Roaring '20s and World War II, what have you, in that 30-year period, about 20s and 30s and 40s, that you would just like to tell people about? Eunice, we'll start with you.
Well, the only thing that I would like to see, it affected me a lot, just personally, and like it did other people, losing so many of my students that I'd had in school. And I was not a mother, but I was sad, almost like a mother, because I loved those people. And it was a very sad time for so many, many people. And then it could have been a very happy time for everybody, but it was a sad time for the people who had lost their boys, and the mothers and the fathers and the relatives of the ones who had been killed in the war. But that's my memories of the end of the war. And I remember Mr. Cipollata was a great singer, and he would sing, even though he was a prisoner out at Fort Missoula, he was allowed to sing in the Mendelssohn Club. And he is a 50-year member of the Mendelssohn Club, and he was allowed to sing as a prisoner when the Mendelssohn Club was first started.
Mm-hmm.
They had this wonderful program depicting World War II at the Mendelssohn Club this year.
Francis, anything you'd like to say?
I came home from Europe in 1933 and got a job, as I said, as secretary in the hardware department of the Mercantile. And I was having a real nice time. Missoula brought a lot of bands to town, Benny Goodman and so on. And I remember real nice dances, and I was having a good time. And then I got married in 1940, and from then on, I became for the first time in my life involved with a ranch, you see. And that was, those were joyous years too, even the years raising turkeys, and the years of the prisoners wandering through and scaring you to death. And so the war was an effort that we joined, not too successfully really, but they were nice years. I look back with fond remembrances of the 40s.
Okay, great. David, your last comments, if you would like to make to anybody about that period of time, between the Roaring '20s and the end of the war.
Well, I guess there's nothing except that I was really concerned about the way we're falling apart, and we should be able to take care of that. And I must go.
Okay, that's it.